Okay, it announces to all of us that we're now recording. Welcome. I want to make sure you know that this program is brought to you by the Texas Night Sky Festival Association. We are, as of this year, still not doing anything in person, but we're so excited to offer this particular event for you and to have Dr. Travis Longcore here this evening. For any of you who have friends who might not be able to be here this evening, but really wanted to hear this, we will be putting the recording on our website, which I'll put later into the chat, but you can probably remember it because of our name. TX, as in the abbreviation for Texas, NSF, as in Night Sky Festival.org. And on that first page of the website, just scroll down to events. This event will be listed with a link to the recording when we finish. I'm going to go ahead and we'll get started. Travis had said that a very simple introduction would work. No need to go into all of his details. That a lot of that was sent in the information. But to keep it simple, I want to share with you that he is a highly respected, prominent, award-winning scientist and researcher. You may know him best from the landmark article, Ecological Light Pollution. You may know him from the book he co-edited with Catherine Rich, Ecological Consequences of Artificial Night Lighting. You may have been introduced to him in the invitation you received for this event. So no matter how you got to know about him, you should know that he is an accomplished environmental consultant. Texas Night Sky Festival Association, of which I'm representing, is just delighted to have him here tonight. Travis, I turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Cindy, and it's so nice to be with you all here today. Let me get some
And
slides up here.
while you're getting slides up, I failed to say one thing. Little housekeeping here. We are going to ask that everyone stays muted until you finish the main part of your presentation and when you're ready to take questions. We also are going to ask that people not put questions or comments in the chat while you're talking, that wait until, we'll have plenty of time for that. We'll have almost an hour blocked off that you can ask questions. We'll go through, all of those in detail, but those can be very distracting for people. So we ask that you not use the chat once you get started. Travis.
Yeah, it's just because I have no scroll and I'll try to answer the questions while they come in instead of paying attention to what I'm doing. There was a comment that did come in about whether or not you can do live transcription. And I don't know if you have that service available or not, but someone did request it if you had it available. So hi, everybody. Thank you.
Yeah, if somebody can, I know that is, should be available. And gosh, if somebody can help me find it, I would be glad to do that.
Cindy, it's Wendy. I asked for it, but it would be on your host panel. It's not visible to regular participants.
Right, and I'm looking, but
like up under view options for you, maybe.
I'm not seeing it under view options. I know I have used it in the past.
It may be that this particular license doesn't have it, so it's okay if, at least from my perspective, yeah. I don't absolutely need it, but if it was available, that would be useful, but not to keep you from starting your program.
Okay, I do not see it on any of the options that I've got here. If let me
That's
look
fine.
One more place. I'm sorry. I don't think we have that in this particular license.
All right.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll all get muted then, and it's up for Travis and let him take over.
All right. So what I thought we'd do is I'll talk for a while, share some things about artificial lighting's impact on life, and by artificial lighting, of course, we mean artificial lighting at night, and then open it up for questions and really have some time to answer, hopefully, or at least respond to the questions that are important to you as you are dealing with advocacy around night skies and night sky protection. I saw there were some gardeners here tonight. I appreciate that. I'm sorry I didn't bring the slide on slugs. That's an interesting one. So if I don't mention slugs, you can come back and ask me a question about slugs later. Um, and uh, and so where I thought I'd start is basically sort of how we got into this. Catherine Rich is my wife. At the time when we got started on this, we were in grad school, and there was this proposal to light a bridge in the port of Los Angeles with, as you can see there, 12 1,000-watt floodlights, um, 7,000-watt xenon lights that were going to be pointed straight up into the sky. It would have been so bright it would have been visible from the moon as a point source with the naked eye if you were able to get up there. And Catherine got a call from somebody at our Fish and Wildlife Agency saying, you got to do something about this. This isn't right, because they knew a little bit about what some of the impacts might be. And so we took it and appealed that decision by the city of LA to the California Coastal Commission. And they found, and this is if you look at the date here, back in 2000, they found that this would have been a significant impact on coastal zone resources. It was the first time that a public agency, to our knowledge in California, 22 years ago, found that lights alone in the night sky were a significant adverse impact. And we ended up with this design, which you look at and you say, that's a lot of blue light. I know blue's not great, but this is a whole lot better than what had been proposed. Which was, instead of the lights shielded from up and down, would have been going straight up into the sky. So this is where we started. And out of this, we met a fellow named Bob Gent. Bob's right here. He passed away far too young, a year or so ago. And he was the president of the International Dark Sky Association and was helpful in our work on the Vincent Thomas Bridge. And Bob said to us, he said, I really think we could use a white paper on the effects of lights on wildlife. I'm fine talking to people about the effects on astronomy, and that there's no question there. And I'm doing all right with the effects on sort of science, and there's a little bit on human health, but I just have a hard time convincing people that the wildlife piece is real. And again, so this is around 2000, and we kind of thought, yeah, not really sure whether we can do anything better than what is out there right now. But we had this idea that we would put together a conference of the people who were working on this issue from around the world, and we knew about them because for several years we'd been collecting just these sort of incidental observations and throwaway lines and things in papers about effects of light at night, because Catherine had been thinking about it as a dissertation topic. And out of that, we said, well, let's do a conference. We're not sure we can do a great new white paper, but we can do a conference. We brought people from Europe and North America who'd never met before, and we had this conference that we held with our nonprofit, the Urban Wildlands Group, and the UCLA Institute of the Environment at UCLA in 2002. And that got a little bit of coverage. It was a really exciting meeting. People sort of started thinking, hey, this might actually be a real thing that we're talking about here. Of course, there were predecessors, and we'll talk about those a little bit, but it was really kind of a unique time to sort of take stock and figure out that this was a real thing. And so this Science News article here was from 2002. from the conference talking about how artificial light might be disrupting ecosystems. Around a similar time, maybe, and this is some coverage from a couple years later, the National Park Service had been working on night skies as well and doing these sort of all sky assessments of light pollution and measurements. And you can see the light dome on the horizon here and the Milky Way across the sky. And so that was going on sort of simultaneously, and it really kicked off and led to two things. This paper that we wrote in 2004 called Ecological Light Pollution, which went into a relatively new but turned into quite a substantially important journal called Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. And then from the conference, we were able to write a edited book proposal and publish ultimately this book, Ecological Consequences of Artificial Night Lighting, which finally came out in 2006. And that really set the stage by bringing together what was known at the time across all of the sort of subdisciplines, the ornithologists and the mammalogists and the entomologists and the even the botanists, all together in a place, the herpetologists, to sort of say, what do we know about the effects of light at night on ecosystems, and how might it be working? And what's happened is now this is something that gets covered in Nature. This is from 2012, I believe, 10 years later, by someone who's one of the leading researchers in all of conservation biology, has picked up the call, gets front page coverage here. This is a couple of years ago in The Scientist and in sort of major journals, experimental work. And so basically what we've seen is this sort of explosion of interest in this topic out of two things. One, sort of recognizing that it's a real thing, and then the fact that we're so dramatically and quickly changing our nighttime environment through the technological changes that really have taken off in the last 10 or 12 years with the LED revolution. So this is what we're talking about here. The difference between the north rim of the Grand Canyon here, this is a hemispherical photograph taken by one of my students with just a tiny little glow here and a campfire on the other side, and comparing to other places on the planet that look like maybe this, which is in the mountains outside of Los Angeles. So that's about 20 miles from where I'm sitting right now. Same hemispherical photograph, but a much shorter duration exposure. That first one was probably about 2 minutes, and this one's probably about 30 seconds. And then some places where we have nature still next to and in cities, and the skies look like that, and even shorter exposure. But here we have lights that are so bright, especially during cloudy skies when the lights of Los Angeles are reflected, where you never experience any conditions in this particular park, Griffith Park, that are any dimmer than the light of a full moon. And so the entire variation of the season of the moon are gone, right? It's this brighter all the time. And this has consequences. And as we all know, as we go into the evening hours, light changes. That gets erased with light pollution. This is this sort of crepuscular view, and we think about it. This is a chart from some data actually out my window here, looking at how the color of the sky changes as the sun sets, and it becomes a signal. And correlated color temperature, CCT, lower color temperatures are more yellow, higher color temperatures are bluer. We'll get back to this in a little bit. This is sort of the color temperature of the blue sky during the day. And as the sun sets, color temperature goes up because the sun is no longer directly in view. And then as it goes down more, and this is the illumination going down here, this is actually lux, not millilux, that's my fault. You see that the color temperature goes up and then declines as the sun goes down over the horizon and we end up into darkness. So this is actually a signal to organisms, the changing color of the sky with dusk, that when you have light pollution sort of takes and chops off part of that variation. And things are cued into that variation. Plants are cued into it. There are plants that simply only open their flowers at night, or their leaves oriented a particular way at night. This sort of movement at night is common throughout the natural world. And then when it does open up, what's going to happen? Pollination at night and if you don't have the light conditions, these things aren't going to happen. Um, the vision of other organisms takes advantage of this changing sky. This is just illustrating just how different things are for other species relative to us. We see in color during the daytime, so twilight and brighter, and this is shown by this rainbow color over here. As it gets darker than that, in dim twilight and moonlight, we're basically seeing in gray, and a little bit of our cones, and as it gets even darker, we're seeing just with our rods and no color whatsoever. Whereas other species, and these are a bee and a bunch of moths, actually two bees and a few moths, are seeing with color vision all the way down into starlight, where they're perceiving color on the landscape and we're not. And this becomes this critical thing when you start thinking about the effects of light on other species, is to perceive it from the perspective of another organism and not just humans. So we don't think so much about color at night, but there are other species that are cueing into it because they're picking up on it from that light from the stars and the moon. A lot of things also have to take a rest at night. The metabolic rate of different bird groups decreases by these percentages at night. So the metabolic rate of a dove is down about 20%. Sparrows go down about 50%. There's a titmice, they go down close to 70%. Hummingbirds reduce their metabolic rate 85%. And so this is cued into the light conditions and of course the temperature as well. But nighttime is, for a lot of species, maybe half of them, this time of rest. But the other half of species, of all species across groups, are nocturnal. And they're taking that time to do what their business, to hunt, to feed, to grow, and do their work. And so if we take what we've learned here over the past couple of decades even now, I try to divide it up into 5 different categories of major impacts of light on wildlife. And of course, wildlife can also include us humans to some degree, because we are cued into the same patterns that every other species on the planet is. We have a very highly conserved and similar mechanisms for perceiving day length and perceiving when it's daytime versus nighttime. And so when we talk about circadian rhythm disruption down here, this is something that humans are feeling as well. So the big categories here: orientation, attraction and disorientation, so species that are either attracted to or repulsed by lights; lack of connectivity, which is sort of a second order effect, but worth talking about, where lights create a barrier on a landscape for things to move across; interference with ecological interactions like pollination and foraging under lights versus under natural conditions; and then just all manner of disruption of the circadian rhythm and follow-on effects from that, which include disruption of the ability to perceive seasons. So I'll walk through some of these here for you and show that there's a long history of us knowing about this stuff. Birds have been attracted, or people have known that birds have been attracted to lights for a long, long time. This is the Eddystone light. It's a painting from 1912 showing migratory birds that are attracted to that very bright light. They get sort of mesmerized by the beam and fall into it and end up not being able to leave it, and then they run into windows and kill themselves. This happens on tall buildings, as you know from news accounts. It happens at tall communication towers. It happens on cruise ships on the ocean, where migratory birds will encounter them, be attracted to the lights, and end up running into windows, or actually taking a rest on a ship in the middle of migration. We can measure these things now using radar. This is an animation from Van Horten, Doran and Horton, looking at radar measurements which show the birds migrating. That sort of flash at the beginning of each of these nights that we're going through here, those are birds that are on the weather radar. You can see the weather systems moving through and then the birds. And these groups now are working on using the weather radar to figure out how birds are being moved off course, and of course encountering tall buildings and becoming the reason that Cindy's asking you to turn your lights off at night. We know this really is an impact because of what happens at the Tribute of Light um, uh, installation in New York City. This is something like what would have been on the Vincent Thomas Bridge if we hadn't stopped it. It was going to be an installation like this, but on 24/7, 365. This installation is only on periodically because of the impact of attracting of birds. Once they get, and I hope I remember this right, something like 1,000 birds in the beams, they turn the lights off and let the birds go away. But we know for a fact that these birds are pulled literally off course from their migratory routes into these beams of light, and then when they get down on the ground level, this impact interacts with glass, and they end up running into glass and getting killed in the hundreds and thousands. This happens other places as well. Juvenile shearwaters in Hawaii. These are seabirds that nest up on the islands, on the volcanic islands, and the juveniles don't fly very well. They can't really take off without a bit of a cliff, and on their first way out from their burrows where they've hatched and been fed by their parents, they're very easily distracted by lights. And so they were talking about moving football games in order to minimize the attraction of these Newell shearwaters. Of course, they're an endangered species, and we want to be able to do this. And the reason you really need to minimize attraction is once they sort of ground themselves under lights, they really need to be rehabbed and released specifically in a place where they can get fly, because they're not really good at getting flying again once they're on the ground. So they really have to make it from these burrows out to the ocean, or basically be killed. And then of course, birds that get hit windows after they're attracted to lights. This is just one from my Uncle Al's camp up in Michigan, that got attracted to a light, and this one thankfully made it. Was stunned for a while, sort of revived him, and off he went. This is an impact around the world, but a lot more in North and South America because of the configuration of our migratory routes. But around the world, light pollution is increasing greatest within these migration pathways for nocturnally migrating birds that are attracted to those lights to their detriment. So what else gets attracted to lights? This is a video from my colleague Gerhard Eisenweiss from Germany. He was one of the participants in the original conference, showing just some decorative lighting in a little town in Germany, and how many insects are being attracted to it. And then what happens? This is probably a metal halide, if I remember right. Light, and insects get attracted to it, and he particularly was interested in this caddisfly that gets on there and takes about that long for that caddisfly to get killed. And so that's the impact, and basically it's an avoidable impact, and in this instance is something that comes from aesthetic lighting, sort of lighting the statue at night, or not statue, a sculpture at night. So this is the attraction, and of course we've known this, like moth to a flame, forever, but it's a significant impact. So if we want to think about what does this mean for organisms moving across the landscape, we do have a mountain lion that lives in that very bright park that I was showing you earlier here in Los Angeles. This is P22, Puma 22, and he's been living in Griffith Park for quite a few years now. And you got to think about what it's like to be an organism that is adapted to nighttime and night vision. Look at those eyes and how big they are. Slit eyes, like they can open up very wide like this and take in enormous amount of light, and be able to see things in a way that we as humans can't. So to them, things that may seem dark are probably bright. And so we tried to figure out how that mountain lion maybe got to Griffith Park, this is that P22's territory here. Downtown Los Angeles is over here. Hollywood is here, Santa Monica, for those of you who know Los Angeles. This is the San Fernando Valley, or the Valley, for those of you old enough to remember Moon Zappa and Valley Girls. And so we created this map, which is showing the shortest, darkest path between Topanga State Park and a couple other parks, which are potential source areas. This entire area is the western Santa Monica Mountains is going to has mountain lions, a population in it, and tried to figure out where the pathway would be that is the darkest path, and how the lights are probably serving as a barrier, because we have good evidence from a number of studies now that indicate mountain lions aren't real crazy about going into brightly lit areas or going through brightly lit areas. And then you're saying, okay, well then why did P22 go over here? The reason is if P22 stayed in the Santa Monica Mountains here, his father would have killed him. Once the males get a certain age, the fathers will they kick them out basically, and so he made the choice of heading over a major freeway here and then making his way through the Hollywood Hills and the canyon that I'm sitting in right now, and over another major freeway, and found this area full of deer, but quite bright in downtown, right next to downtown Los Angeles. But if we think about this isn't a good strategy for survival. And in fact, we've got a freeway here that kills a lot of mountain lions as they try to go between the wildlands here down to there. And we've identified a couple of sites that they might be trying to move across the landscape. And I just want to show you what that looks like. This is that freeway I was just mentioning. This is where P22's father lived, and where he would have lived if he didn't get kicked out. And this is the freeway in the middle. And a lot of animals get killed going across that freeway. It's also brightly this is looking at it from the other side. So any organism trying to move across this landscape has to get across this barrier right here. Now, and we looked at, so these images are taking, they're hemispherical images in one direction. This is looking south of that freeway from the route you'd have to take to get across the freeway. And just to give you a sense of how disturbing this might be for an organism that doesn't necessarily like to be out in the light. This is not an optimal condition for the use of freeway underpass. In this case, there is a culvert, and an animal could go through there. A mountain lion could go through there, but not too crazy about coming down here and exposing them to these conditions. And so there is actually right now proposed and will be built a wildlife overcrossing at this site. And I'm working with the design team, and they're designing it in such a way to put up berms that will block these lights and the lights of the cars to give the animals a dark path across the freeway and not have them exposed to this incredibly bright situation as they try to move across the landscape. Because nighttime is incredibly important for organisms that are interacting with humans. These are some pictures from a camera trap study I did with some students at an underpass north of Los Angeles. And just sort of a random sample. You look at the colors here, you can see that's the color of dawn. Anybody who's been up at dawn knows that's what that looks like. And the rest of them are at night, and we had hundreds of these things, and every so often you'd get one during the daytime. But mostly it's at night. And this has been shown around the world that human activity has pushed animal activity into the nighttime hours, including for species that otherwise would be perfectly happy to roam around and do their things during the day, like coyotes. Coyotes are perfectly happy doing things during the daytime, and you all probably know that in Texas. But in this particular area, because of the amount of human activity, they don't necessarily like to mix it up with them, and they move their activity into the night. The deer do the same thing. They're sort of hanging out quietly during the day, and then they get active in the crepuscular hours and early evening and early morning. So this is sort of an effect that makes the nighttime environment even that much more important in areas with a lot of people. It also just changes circadian rhythms of animals in urban areas. This one is a study that came out a few years back looking at the signaling of birds, in this instance blue tits, which are species that are common in Europe, and they were sensitive and were singing during when they were close to streetlights. And so young birds that weren't actually very experienced or fit and probably shouldn't be getting the females to mate with were attracting females to mate with because they were singing early in the morning, which was a signal normally of being a healthy bird. Except in this instance, they were singing early because there were lights that were waking them up in the morning, and they were singing early. And so it sort of is messing up the reproductive signaling between the males and the females, between the two. Another example of this circadian disruption that goes the next step further are these soybeans. I know this is sort of a grainy old picture. I got this from some folks in the University of Nebraska Extension. And these are winter soybeans. And winter soybeans only set seed when the day length gets short enough. And what you can see here is that there's lights along this divided highway, and then there's a series of green patches here in the soybeans. What you need to know is that once they set seed, they turn brown because they've set seed, and then you can harvest them. Well, they're green, they haven't set seed yet. And each of these green patches is associated with one of those lights, and it's an area where the soybeans have not detected that the day length is short enough to set seed. And in fact, they never will because they're under these lights. And so all that green area is lost revenue to this farmer because of the light pollution from the divided highway here. And that's because, day length is a cue of seasonality, and the lights here are sufficiently bright to interrupt perception of day length by the plants. Now, you don't have to worry too much about this farmer, because this site, I learned when I got the permission to use this photograph, this site has now been developed and is a Walmart. So there you have it. Next thing that happens, interactions between organisms. So pollination, predator-prey relationships. There's a lot of nocturnal pollination goes on, especially and even in our crops, plants, our garden plants, etc. And those relationships and pollination really depend on natural darkness conditions. They get pretty significantly impacted by light, and there's a whole bunch of studies coming out on this in the last 3, 4, 5 years. And then we have studies now that are even sort of combining them, looking at circadian impacts and then interactions between species. This was a study from 3 years back now, looking at Chicago, and they had a huge data set of camera traps, and then they had some satellite data, or actually it was the International Space Station taking photographs and charting areas that were, in this study, their bright cutoff was 6 lux, which is very, very bright, and dark, in quotes, was under 6 lux. But they found in those very bright areas that the species that would normally be active at night were pushing their activity until later in the night. They weren't as active early in the night as they were when it was darker. And the opposite was going in with diurnal species were active more into the nighttime, completely affecting interactions between species in terms of predator and prey, the hunters and the hunted. So we've got all these impacts, and I could go on probably for another hour just giving you examples of impacts of lights on organisms, and I'm sure you all know some and have examples that you can share as well. But the thing I really wanted to set up for us to talk about is what we can do about it, and what we can do about it in the face of the current transition that's going on from high pressure sodium lights, which are the orange lights, as you probably or may know in this image, and high color temperature, full spectrum, bright LEDs, which is what this bridge is illuminated with. This is Los Angeles, by the way, and this is what passes for a river. It's actually the channel that the river has been channelized into, but that's a topic for another talk. So how do we minimize these impacts in the face of what's going on in the LED world? And the answer, is simultaneously simple and incredibly difficult and complicated. And there's really 5 things. Convince people to only light where they need to. Convince people to turn lights off when they're not in use, so using motion detectors or timers or something. Only using as much light as you need in terms of intensity. directing it where it needs to go, and then using the lowest possible correlated color temperature, or CCT, for the goal of the lighting. And we're going to talk about that a bit more, just to really go through where the research is on that and why this is an important element. But it's fifth here, even though we're going to talk about it a bunch, because these other things, you know, if you can not have a light, you don't have to worry about color temperature. If you turn the light off, you don't have to worry about the color. If you reduce intensity, you know, intensity is always going to be more important than the color temperature, and putting it where it needs to be. So even though we have a lot of discussion today about color temperature, and I want to explain it and why it's so important, advocating around these first four is really is first, and then if something is going to be lit and it has to be lit for certain human safety reasons, then we have ways to minimize the impact using spectrum. And so I just want to make that really clear at the outset of where we're headed with this. So these essentially, to illustrate it another way, for those of you who are visual learners, I got these done by a landscape architecture student we were working with on a thing for the National Park Service. So lights going off at a certain time, we call that part night lighting, or motion detector would be a similar thing here. So that's the lights are on when you need them, they're off when you don't. Turning down the intensity, or dimming in terms of sometime during the night. So you can, you know, lights don't always have to be the same brightness through the entire period. You can have a higher setting and a lower setting, or some sort of sliding scale. Spectral control, the thing that we're going to talk about a bit more, going to lower color temperatures or more yellow and red lights, and then shielding. You know, the worst, of course, being these glare bombs that go everywhere, a taller standard that's shooting light down, or here even a bollard that's getting light down on the ground only where it's needed, and nowhere else. So spectrum then can mitigate if intensity is fixed. In other words, if you have to have lights of a certain brightness, and I'm thinking here, often what I'm dealing with are street lights, where jurisdictions want to meet the um, uh, Illuminating Engineering Society standards so that they don't get sued, and they are given a certain standard they want to meet so that their lawyers will sign off on what they're doing, or and so when you have that situation, and this might be a parking lot, it might be an entrance to a building, it might be anything where there are standards and people are like, we have to meet this standard. Currently, those standards don't tell you what color you have to meet the light with. They just tell you how bright it needs to be. And I'm going to show you why that's so important, because you can use spectrum then to meet the standard, but to minimize impacts. And this is an image also from Gerhard Eisenbeis, who did that caddisfly dying on the lamp video, of an experimental setup along a river. This is actually a river in Germany, similar sort of a shape as our LA River, except they've got lawn on the edge and then a channel down here. But all these different colors are different lighting types. So how does this work? So I want to go through and show you a series of images here that sort of illustrate how we measure and can change the impact of light depending on their color. So these charts have a certain amount of light that is expressed in these colors in the background. So all white light is made up of all the different colors. Daylight has all the different colors in it, and it's this line here that has the vivid colors in the background. So the red over here gets into heat over there. On this side there's ultraviolet, and then the blues and the greens and the yellow. And then in the back here, the thing behind it that goes up there is the human daytime light response to those wavelengths. We respond most to the wavelengths that are right here in the green and the yellow and whatnot in our daytime vision. This is called our photopic vision. And it decreases, our sensitivity to light decreases into the blue and it decreases into the red. So that's this outlined curve right here. That's the human photopic visual curve, all right, visual response. And if we add up, okay, so human vision there, spectral output of our light, daytime there. If we add them up, we get this sort of pastel in the front, which is like how much that lighting source interacts with human vision. And you can see it's quite a bit. Our human daytime vision is pretty well adapted to see things in the daytime. And so our nighttime vision is pushed farther to the left, and we see slightly shorter wavelengths, or more sensitive to the shorter wavelengths during the nighttime. So a measurement of how much a particular light source affects a particular sensor, in this instance the human vision, but it could be other things, is how big this sort of pastel color is in the front. So that's daylight and daytime vision. And so this is a high pressure sodium light, those old orange lights, and human daytime vision. So again, we have the spectral output. So those high pressure sodium always looks like this. It's got a lot of output in the orange and the red. It's got a little bit down here in sort of aqua into the blue and the shorter wavelengths, but not a whole lot. And it's got output out here into the longer red wavelengths as well. And it has a yellow peak. All high pressure sodium looks like that. It has a color temperature of 1900. Color temperature, again, tells us how much yellow versus blue is in a light. High color temperatures have a lot of blue. Low color temperatures have a lot of yellow and red. This is a relatively low color temperature. So 1900 Kelvin, high pressure sodium with human daytime vision, and we can see, right, human vision, and we have that overlap there. So it's reasonable, and we can see quite a bit under this, but you can't see colors really great because there's not so much of every color there, but we can make do. Here then is a 4200 Kelvin LED. And so it has this characteristic shape of a peak in the blue and then another peak in the longer wavelengths. It's sort of two humps there. This is pretty much all of the streetlight type LED applications are going to be shaped like this to some degree, and that's because they're built on an actual blue LED that has emissions here, and then there's a phosphor on them that absorbs that blue light and then re-radiates it out across the spectrum. So you can see there's a lot of intersection here with our daytime vision, and so we see really well under these. We see, but there's also this blue peak over here that's not doing us a whole lot of good at all. So that's a 4200. So it's relatively blue-rich LED, although some of the earlier ones were even 5000 Kelvin. You can see that would even be more blue-tinged than that. Compare this with a 2200 Kelvin LED. And this is the great thing about LEDs, is they're not all the same. So this one has much lower emissions in the blue, but it has that still peak there for the light, and the rest of it is re-radiated off of it. So you see the blue pump peak here, and then it's radiated longer wavelengths over there, and then intersecting with daytime vision, and you can see pretty well under 2200 Kelvin, and actually quite a bit of color as well. Compare that to, say, melatonin suppression. So what's melatonin? Melatonin is the hormone that we all produce at night in the dark. It is our nighttime hormone, and it's associated with all sorts of good things. It regulates a number of other systems. It's associated with our digestive system. It's associated with our reproductive system. It's associated with being it's an oncostatic hormone, meaning it keeps cancers from growing. There's a whole bunch of good stuff that happens from melatonin, but you only produce it in the dark. And the photoreceptors that we use to figure out whether it's dark or not don't help us make images. They're not our daytime vision. They're not our nighttime vision. They're actually these things called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which you don't have to remember that, no quiz. But they're non-image forming photosensors in our eyes, and they have a sensitivity that's right down here in the blue, almost where the peak of the blue of the daytime light from the sun is. And so daylight is this incredibly good signal that it is daytime. Imagine that, right? And so we're very sensitive, as are pretty much every other organism is sensitive at this peak as well, to know that it is either daytime or, in the absence of it, that it is nighttime. So if you want to suppress melatonin, get out in the daytime. That's great. You want it suppressed in the daytime, but you want it dark at night because then that's going to get produced, and it's going to get produced in the right amounts. Here's a 1900 Kelvin HP high pressure sodium light and the melatonin suppression curve. Not a whole lot. There's some interaction, right? So there's some down here. But if you look at the interaction between those two things, it's very low. And high pressure sodium light does not actually suppress melatonin very much. Here's that 4200 Kelvin LED. It's got a different peak, but it certainly intersects with it quite significantly. And so there's, and I will show you a chart in a bit that shows you exactly how much, but there's a considerably bigger signal that it's daytime to humans and every other species when you're under a 4200 Kelvin light compared to a 2200 Kelvin light. There's still a bunch, and that's still more than a high pressure sodium lamp, but it's not as much as the 4200. Then let's look at something else. Let's look at moths. So moths are attracted to light. Everybody pretty much has seen that at one point or another. And they are actually attracted to a peak in the ultraviolet, the very short wavelengths down here. And so anything with ultraviolet lights, moths tend to be incredibly attracted to. So that's their curve in the background. There's the daylight here in the foreground, and then this overlap between the two. So daylight or high color temperature light would be very attractive. High pressure sodium and moth attraction, much less. Some, and you do see, moths around old high pressure sodium lamps. But look what happens when we do a 4200 Kelvin light, much greater, or than a 2200 Kelvin is less, but not as much. So if you can see how if we can take and we know something about the spectral response of an organism and the spectral output of a light, we can start to reconcile these two things together in order to make some predictions about what would be good for reducing impacts, being able to intersect with that human photopic or scotopic curve, but avoiding the danger zones for other species. So this is sort of a simplistic view of that between humans and deer. Deer don't see in the orange or the red. So basically, I discovered this when somebody contacted me to figure out what kind of light they should put into a hospital for racehorses. So an animal hospital for racehorses, that they wanted to minimize the circadian disruption on the animals that were recovering. And so I went and looked up a bunch of literature on, big herbivorous mammals, and they don't see in the red or the orange. So you could actually use lights that are red and orange, and humans would be able to see to do things, to be active and whatnot. But in this instance, deer and in fact horses wouldn't see that at all. So that's sort of the simplistic view. Here's a more complex view from a paper we did a few years back looking at insects. This is sort of a generic response curve for insects that are based on the three pigments that most insects have, a sort of a violet, ultraviolet, a blue, and a green. And this is the response curve there that is based on these three curves plus some information from the field. Well, actually, a bunch of information from the field, to be quite honest. So if we wanted to minimize insect attraction, generically, we know we want to avoid this stuff down here, the blue and the near ultraviolet. This comes out in research. So back to Gerhard Eisenbeiss and a study that he did, looking at mercury vapor, mellow halide, high pressure sodium, and then two LEDs. Mercury vapor has ultraviolet light to it, and so it's quite attractive. Metal halide has a lot of blue in it, very attractive. His HPS had a bit of blue and ultraviolet, and it was more attractive. And then cool white LEDs and warm white LEDs. This is actually reassuring in that we can see here that for insects at least, LEDs are not the end of the world, but you can be, 3 times better by using a warm white LED as opposed to a cool white LED. And if you go to even, a yellow or a red LED, that number would decrease even more. And we can even adjust lights depending on how you go about achieving a specific color to minimize it. So CCT, this correlated color temperature, can be achieved in different ways. This bottom chart here, these are emissions by wavelength of a compact fluorescent bulb. Those of you remember those funny things we had for a while there. And it always has these emission peaks, and that has a color temperature of 2700 Kelvin, which is about the same as an incandescent, an old school 60-watt incandescent bulb, which is right about here on the spectrum. So this is 1,000 to 10,000. 1,000 is very yellow-red, 10,000 is very blue. And so 2700 right here, about an incandescent. This curve here is also a 2700 Kelvin LED. And this one here in the green is a 2700 Kelvin LED off the shelf. And so we actually showed in a study that you can adjust the spectral composition of lights in order to avoid specific things like insect attraction. So here we are out in the field with these custom LEDs that we've tuned to avoid the areas of the spectrum that are most attractive to the insects while still providing full spectrum light for people. And the application here was going to be using these lights indoors in the tropics where there aren't a lot of screens or glass to minimize attraction of disease vectors indoors. But we did this study in Los Angeles. Here are those mountains I was telling you about before. We collected a lot of insects. I did this with a bunch of undergraduates at UCLA. They sorted 5,000 insects out to order, and what we were able to show is that even for lights of the same color temperature, we were able to reduce the insect attraction by avoiding those areas of the spectrum in achieving the color temperature that were most attractive to different groups. And this is especially evident in the moths here, the Lepidoptera, which have this particular attraction to the blue light. So the compact fluorescent here, this is a 2700 Kelvin compact fluorescent. This is a 2700 Kelvin LED off the shelf. And then these are our two custom ones that we did and tweaked the composition of the light spectrally so that it still looked the same to people, but was less attractive to the insects. So it was a pretty convincing study for us to make the claim and stand by the claim that we can really use spectrum to achieve human goals, but while reducing but not eliminating impacts on other species. And why is this so important now? There are all sorts of different lighting choices out there. Every one of these curves on this chart is some lighting source or another. Some of them, well, I got the moon on here, but there's a bunch of LEDs. There's a high pressure sodium, low pressure sodium, some custom LEDs. We got fluorescence. We've got something called a yard blaster, a metal halide. All of these, we need a way to be able to assess quickly whether a light is going to have a lot of impact or a little impact. And so we published this about 4 years ago. And as all of these, and I put these on the bottom here, the far right is the red, the far left is the ultraviolet and the violet, and it's the rainbow in between. And we, at that time, sort of pulled together a number of different response curves. So moth attraction right here, that's that curve I was just showing you. These are ones that have to do with dark sky or scattering of light in the sky for sky glow, the starlight index. But we also have the human melatonin suppression curve. We have a couple green turtle curves and loggerhead hatchlings and bee attraction and bird and whatnot. We took all these and put them together. And this was sort of take one, where there's maybe 4 or 5 different sort of species we're looking at, or a generic insect curve. And I've now got this curve list up to 34 or 35 curves that I'm working with. But this is ranking them according to how much they would affect an overlap with different wildlife species. So the shorter the bar, the better in this instance. And the top one here is a low pressure sodium. And a low pressure sodium light, one, you can't buy them anymore. And two, they're basically monochromatic yellow. Astronomers love them because you can filter them out by just putting a yellow filter. And then you see everything else. It's beautiful. And so from a wildlife perspective, all things being equal, unless you've got fireflies, and fireflies are their own special deal, low pressure sodium is great. We have a couple of other high pressure sodium is right down here as well. That's the HPS. We have a couple of filtered LEDs. They're sort of 2700 Kelvin LED that's had the blue filtered out of it. We have a PC amber, which is a phosphor coated amber LED. And then we go all the way up to the things like the Yard Blaster up here, and the Los Angeles 4200 Kelvin LEDs up here that are much more damaging in terms of their interactions and whatnot. I did another one where we looked at giving a penalty to the lights that didn't have good color rendering, because often people are like, well, I need to be able to see color. Now, whether or not that's true or not, whether you actually need to know all colors with perfection at night is up for debate, but let's just take it as a fact. We gave a penalty to lights that did not have good color rendering. And so the shortest bars are the best bars here now still. And this puts the PC amber, this is a phosphor coated amber, and some of these filtered LEDs that have very good color rendering, but have much lower emissions in those areas of the spectrum that are going to impact insects and sea turtles and birds and fish and things like that. Now, this is fully, acknowledged. Here we are, 2022. This was done in 2018. We've got a bunch more species we can look at now and optimize for. This was just proving and showing that we could do it. We also have tools where you can do this. This is an online tool where you can bring your own spectrum. You have to deploy it on a website, and I could show somebody how if they were interested. But we have the interactive tools to be able to see how different attraction or impacts, photosynthesis, human vision, melatonin suppression interact with different light things. So this is basically a bunch of little charts that are like those rainbow charts I was showing you just a minute earlier. Now, what if you don't have time for all that? What if you're like, I'm busy, the scientists can worry about that part. What's my rule of thumb? The rule of thumb, this is a chart that I put together for the Illuminating Engineering Society, because they came to me and said, isn't there something better than correlated color temperature to figure out the impacts on wildlife? And so I ran a bunch of regressions between a bunch of potential indicators. The amount of light under 530 nanometers, the amount of light under 500 nanometers, the melatonin suppression curve, etc., and correlated color temperature. And what I want you to see here is that correlated color temperature, which is this first column here, is actually the best of them all at this point. It explains probably 70% of the variation of the amount of insects that you're attracting, less for other things, birds, which have different visual systems, much less explanatory power. But if I had to still pick one thing, the one thing I would say is use the lowest color temperature you can. It's going to correlate with these other things, but I don't think we need to worry about them at this stage of the game. Use the lowest correlated color temperature that you can. If somebody says, oh, I need to see more color, okay, fine. Give you a light with a little more blue that's going to allow you to see that color a little better, but stick with the lowest that you can go with. And what's down there? The low pressure sodium, high pressure sodium, and phosphor coated amber, and filtered LEDs. Low color temperatures, yellow. This is, now, we did that study, and I got approached by scientists from the Smithsonian, and they had been contracted by a hydrocarbon firm in Peru to figure out what color lights they should use at a pipeline that had to go into the lowland Peruvian Amazon forest. So there was going to be lights there. That was going to happen. The pipeline was permitted. That was going to happen. And the question was, we have to light. What should we light with? And so I hooked them up with some calculations first, and then some lamps to try to reduce this phenomenon here. These are all insects that are attracted to this light. A bright light in a dark area is the worst possible thing, and then the naive area that's never had artificial light before, you get huge amounts of biomass in terms of insects. And so we sent them down with a 3000 Kelvin LED, and then two filtered LEDs from a firm out of Arizona that reduce the amount of blue emissions, one to the point that it was a yellow light and one to the point that it was an amber light. So red and what we were able to show there is that both the number of species, which is this chart here, and the number of individuals, and these are outliers here, but you need to know that this is a very significant decrease between the average number of individuals at the white light versus the yellow light versus the amber light. Same with the number of individuals and the number of morphospecies. We predicted it ahead of time. We even predicted the order in which these would be, that this one that was yellow would be slightly more attractive to insects than the amber one. It was, and that the control basically doesn't attract insects. So this was an after the fact proof of this approach that, assessing the spectrum of light for a particular group is actually works to be able to reduce those impacts. I will also add, high correlated color temperature increases sky glow as well. These curves over here, so this is from a study from Pacific Northwest Labs from the Department of Energy, not mine. I should have put a credit on that on this slide. Apologies to them. But these shapes over here are spectral emissions curves for LEDs. You see that blue pump that you're now familiar with. You know what the blue pump is. And so this is like 5,000 down to probably 2,700 Kelvin LEDs. And this one is a filtered LED with no emissions in the blue. And it turns out that compared to high pressure sodium, which is this line across here, the red line, the sky glow impact is greater for every single one of these, except for the filtered LED that takes out the blue. And so this is a really important thing for the sort of multifaceted problem that light pollution is, because it's not just the direct glare, it's not just direct light, it's the glow as well. And getting the blue out of the lights helps everybody else in the surrounding as well, and it helps the astronomers, and it helps us see the Milky Way. So that, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, and I'd take an amen if I could get one, but this is the great thing here, is that the research from a wildlife side, with the exception of bioluminescent organisms, fireflies, and also in the tropics, we had attraction to our yellow lights of the bioluminescent beetles in the Peruvian Amazon as well. So that's the exception. Bioluminescent organisms are an exception, and there you got to mitigate by decreasing the intensity or not lighting. But this is really critically important. So we know enough now to take action on mitigation. So this is the chart I promised you before about circadian impacts relative to high pressure sodium. High pressure sodium here is 100%. All these different light types, metal halide and 3000 Kelvin LEDs and 4000 Kelvins, and even if it were bright enough, the full moon, but it's not bright enough, have greater circadian impacts than high pressure sodium. And we can reduce by using these filtered LEDs, these which are here, a phosphor coated amber here, or low pressure sodium. And this Anna's light is just an extremely filtered LED that was produced. There are commercially available products that fall into these categories. This is a 2000 Kelvin LED street light. I'd like that shielded better, but it's good for illustrative purposes. This is a filtered LED street light from Chips and Wafers. So this one is probably 22,000 or below LED. So it's there, it's commercially available, and you can get people to do it. These filtered LEDs, just to show you how this works, this is from Chips and Wafers as well, out of Arizona. An installation of filtered LEDs they did in Hawaii to minimize impacts on those seabirds that we were talking about, and also minimize impacts on astronomy. It was going to get converted to LEDs. They converted to these filtered LEDs that look like this, yellow. And then this is just an image where they pulled out the red and the green. There's plenty of red and green in there, but if you look down here, there's almost no blue. And the blue that you can see actually corresponds with white lights that you can actually see inside the city at that point. And so if we're talking about minimizing astronomical impacts, could it be better? Yeah, it could always be better. You can always shield more, you can always reduce more. But if you're stuck between the hard place of having to make standards for regulatory reasons and wanting to reduce other impacts, we can use spectrum to do that. This is now being accepted and done in cities and towns. Um, of course, Arizona with its observatories has a history of that. Tucson, Flagstaff, etc., and doing LED retrofits that actually reduce the amount of light pollution. And in fact, I also consulted to the city of Salt Lake, and they developed a new streetlight master plan and have agreed to minimize the correlated color temperature in environmentally sensitive areas and put a maximum color temperature in residential areas of 2700 Kelvin and a maximum of 3000 in commercial zones. It's a trade-off, it's a compromise, but if it's something that we can do and actually have it installed as opposed to wish we had something better, I'm going to take that progress any day of the week. So just as a few images to stop with, we know things that are bad, right? Direct glare, it's obvious. Water that shines into light and is direct glare. This is up around Seattle. Factory here. The fish don't like this too much. Even things like this for you gardeners. These little solar lights affect beetle distribution and beetle behavior. And should mention the slugs. There was a multi-year study of slugs and light pollution. They found that the area that was lit increased in slug abundance, but it showed up only after 2 years, like a 4-year experiment. And by the 4th year, they had a dramatically increased number of slugs under the lit areas compared to the control areas. So better color here, but not shielded. This is a residential neighborhood in Los Angeles. Uh, Great color and shielded. This is designed by Clanton and Associates, the lighting design firm out of Boulder, Colorado. And of course, Nancy Clanton, Dane Sanders, leaders in environmentally friendly lighting. This is Tillett lighting design out of New York. It's a little taller, but very focused light and good color temperature. You're not seeing the lamps so much as you're seeing the light from them. And then you add this to maybe some controls in terms of the curfew and the time that you turn them out, dimming perhaps in the parking lot or off when the lot is closed, and all of a sudden we can achieve the things that we need to achieve in terms of safety and human use and avoid those unintended consequences by staying away from the bright lights, the direct glare, and all those things, and the wavelengths that are most impactful to wildlife. So this is, you also don't want to turn out like Los Angeles here. This is the 4th of July from the observatory just outside of Los Angeles, looking down at our incredibly light polluted city and the insanity that goes on during the 4th of July. You got a lot of places that aren't like this. Don't let them get like this. Have a celebration for whenever you want to celebrate, but the lighting situation is really out of control. Think about ways. I put this in because it's a nice color temperature, but should that be shielded if it's outdoors? Yeah. Or we just turn it off when it needs to be turned off. So I want to stop here, and that should have been more or less an hour of content, but really the heart of this starts now, where hopefully I've stimulated some questions, or you've got ideas and things that you want to know more about from this topic. I see Deborah Moran's hand up.
Go ahead, Debbie, ask your question.
Yeah, you can unmute. Go ahead.
Unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Hold on.
Yeah, are we still?
Now you can unmute.
Thank you. Yeah. So absolutely lower color temperature is better. But I'm in Houston. It's already as bad as Los Angeles, if not worse, because we have not moved to warmer street lights. I am increasingly convinced that the problem we have in light pollution is that we are environmentalists are asking people to light differently from people in charge of their safety. So I found, for instance, in Houston, although our police chief was very supportive, I just spoke at a supportive super neighborhood meeting. And right before I spoke, the policeman who was there said, now I want to tell you, you need bright light. The criminals are afraid of light. The brighter, the better. And the only downside is you'll need blackout shades. So he listened to my 20-minute talk and he completely turned around. But what really surprised me is he said, I don't think many people are aware of the melatonin issue. So even the health aspect of my talk was completely unfamiliar to him, and he was very receptive. And I think as long as we have environmentalists, the impression that environmentalists are telling people to do differently from those in charge of their safety, it's a constantly losing battle, especially in the large cities. So I think we need to approach the Major Cities Chiefs Association. I don't think I can do that by myself, but I'm trying and get this information to the policemen. The other thing is we have a lot more support in IES RP 8-18, which Chris Monrad urged me to buy. And that information, those changes have not gotten to the cities. They're still an old thing. So for instance, in section 2.3.4.2, they talk about the two spectral sensitivity curves. You mentioned scotopic and photopic. And they say, well, actually under street lighting, you're using photopic vision. And in that range, the blue light's way down the curve. You actually see best in about high pressure sodium range. They do talk about using shorter wavelength for peripheral vision. So we can probably split the difference there. And another misconception I came was we found that in this very supportive super neighborhood, they were like, well, this is great. We've got a guy here who is with Cooper Lighting. And he was arguing, he was all for the shielding, but he was arguing with me about color. He said, well, you get better color rendition with a shorter wavelength light. But I was told by Crossroads LED that actually their CRI is pretty similar for amber versus 4000K. So the Cooper Lighting guys sent me some brochures, and they have, for the same light, they have all the way from 2200K to 6500K. Every single CRI was 70. So they were exactly equal. You might see the colors differently, but as far as exact rendition, they were equivalent. And so we have all this information that we can shoot down some of these misconceptions.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe just a few thoughts on that. One is that, color rendering index is really not a great metric, because basically all it says is how different you are from a black body of that color temperature. So yellow under yellow, low color temperature light is going to look different than a high color temperature light. The question is whether people need to see color like that at night, when we've gotten along just fine for 60 years of high pressure sodium without having a high ability to see and discern colors. There's a question of what the reason for that is. I agree about the need to have a multifaceted approach that isn't environmentalist versus somebody else. And it was really illustrative, the experience in Salt Lake City, where and I didn't lead these meetings, but I was brought in as to do the abbreviated version of what I just did here, and and answer questions about wildlife impacts. But we had focus groups that included the police and the fire, and planning and transportation and the bike community, and if what was fascinating that came out of it is the sort of surveillance state has changed as well. The police have that cameras that they had out where they could keep an eye on things were getting blown out by the LEDs. And so they were more than happy for the LEDs to be, the street lighting to be dimmer and even be dimmable. so that they could see better with the camera systems. The fire department had no problem with lower color temperature or lower illumination. Everyone was excited about, and it's written into the plan, the idea of controls as well. And this is the great promise of LEDs, is that controls, meaning that you can either control the color temperature, which you can on some lights, or that you can control the intensity. And they like the idea of being able to have the head of street lights be able to turn the lights to full power after a basketball game got out downtown, lots of pedestrians, turn the lights all the way up for an hour or two, and then he could put them back down 50%. And that was very appealing to them, to be able to have the flexibility, and police as well. And I've taught this. I used to teach to sort of returning students in a master's program, one of whom was a policeman. He's like, he was a special, one of the guys who arrests people when they don't want to be arrested. Let's put it that way. And he's like, we hated lights when we were going to do a raid. We'd go out the night before and shoot out the lights. And then come and then take night vision, and no one ever saw us coming. So he was like, darkness is different under different circumstances, and so you can find common ground on these things. There is an enormous amount of old school rule of thumb that's wrong, though, that gets shared, and it happens with the police and this of, bright lights are going to reduce crime. There's no study that conclusively shows us that. There is the same thing with we have here with fuel modification for wildfires. If you clear this amount, you're going to be no. If you don't take care of your house, you're going to burn anyway. There's just these are like easy crutches that get repeated that we have to work so hard to try to replace with better sticky ideas, right? Because those are like sticky ideas that this is going to protect us from crime. And we need a better sticky idea. And one of them is it's messing with our circadian systems. And I saw somebody in the chat was talking about the public health issues of this. And I didn't share with you any of my research on the human impacts, but it's there and we're showing it. And it's an incredible environmental justice issue as well, because it's people who live in the poorest areas are being exposed disproportionately to really horrible lighting and having worse sleep as a result. So thank you for that, Deborah, and thank you for all your advocacy that you've been doing. Amanda, yeah.
Mentioned that one of the things that the IDA Texas chapter is in the process of putting together information putting together a plan where we would actually have staff in Texas and be able to pull together all of those groups into have representatives from them in one group that then can discuss these issues and work them through, just like you have the stakeholders in Salt Lake City to have that statewide. So I would ask for people to be watching for that and support the chapter.
Yeah, and the ace in the hole is that you can save money if you do this right. Yeah, which is another great thing.
Exactly.
So Amanda is
Amanda,
next.
yes.
Yeah. You can unmute. Almost.
Unmute. That was my literal question. The town in which I live in only cares about finances. We're a AAA bond rated city, and that's all I know about us. Because when I ask anything about the environment, they're like, "But we have good taxes," and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I don't care. Like I should care, but I don't understand money." So, can you please talk about the cost saving benefits of doing this? Because that is something I can speak to my city council and my other stakeholders about, that they would care about and listen to.
Right.
And Amanda, where are you? Just
I'm North Texas Master Naturalist, so I'm in DFW, specifically
Excellent.
Carrollton.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so there's two things that cities can do. One, they can do regulations for private property that don't cost them any money, except for the staff money to produce them. And we need things like that. And some cities choose to take that approach first. But if they're looking at their own lights, so municipal lighting, and the biggest component of that is the street lighting system, if they are not already converted to LEDs, the conversion ultimately can save them operational money, right? There's an upfront cost, obviously, of getting the equipment in and doing it. If they include controls, which is an extra expense, but then that allows you to centrally, or in some instances, like Huntington Beach here in California, the municipal folks can go out with an iPad and go, oh, let me turn the lights down on this street, and they can turn the lights down. If they do it in a way where they do a master plan with a qualified lighting design firm, engineering firm, they can have a very short payback period and be saving money. If they do it poorly and put up lights that everybody hates and then they have to do it again, then they're going to waste money. And so if they're heading in that direction, the key is always to sort of point to the mistakes that have happened, like Davis, California, 4,000 Kelvin lights, and people freaked out, didn't like them, hated them, and then they said, okay, we're going to take a step back and we're going to do this over and we're going to do it right. And they ended up dramatically reducing the intensity, which means less energy use, changing the color temperature, and now everybody's happy. Salt Lake City was a similar example. They got to doing their master plan because they started doing high color temperature LEDs, and people were like, no, you're not going to make us live with this. And they took a step back. They took it in a couple of years, in fact, to go through the full sort of stakeholder involvement, negotiated solutions to get to a new place. But ultimately, they should be able to save money, but to save that money, you have to spend some money.
Travis, there's a question in the chat to say, does anybody know of research done on the effects to potted plants that are exposed to residential porch lighting during the night, preventing the flora fauna from receiving hours of darkness?
Yeah, interesting. So I don't know how much on potted plants, but there's work on plants in general and putting them into experimental contexts. At a certain point, plants can actually photosynthesize under night lighting, and that just has to do with how bright it is. The big effect that we see that's been documented the most is on the seasonality of plants. You saw the example with the soybeans, but the other is with leaf loss for deciduous plants. If a deciduous plant doesn't detect that the day is getting shorter, it holds on to its leaves past when it should, and rather than grabbing those resources back into the plant, they get frozen, and they don't drop their leaves when they should. And there's tons of examples of trees where half the tree has its leaves and the other half doesn't. It's the half next to the street light that has the leaves on it. Do we have the studies that then connect that with lifetime survival and thriving, etc., of the plants? Not to my knowledge. We can deduce using our brains and not too big a leap of logic that it's not good. Yeah, so that's as much as I know about that. Probably at this point, someone could do a great science fair project on that, and actually we could learn something.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat from, I believe, from Wendy Williams, who says that anybody study light effects on possible bio-triggered violence or criminal activity? And she's not talking about the, light it up to deter crime that we often hear about, but just a human biological implication.
Short answer is, I don't know of any of that research at this point. The longer answer is, because of the work that I do and that I'm out in about talking about it is people approach me about things. And one of the things I've been approached about are people who have a real adverse physiological response to high color temperature LEDs. Probably, I'm guessing it has to do with the flicker, if it's not a great LED, or something about it just um, exacerbates their or it excites their autonomic nervous system and makes it very difficult for them to function. People who like literally get headaches, and the same with LED headlights. They're like, and they describe it as basically almost as a disability, where they can't function uh, when they're in certain types of light. And it isn't very big of a jump to imagine that people who are put into stressful situations that may end up potentially having conflict in them, that there would be more adverse violent outcomes if people are reacting that badly to the light that's in the surroundings. But I'm in speculation land here.
Thank you, Travis. Another question from the chat, working through that. Jean says, so what kind of light can I get at places like Walmart that would be good to use?
Okay. So I can't tell you what's in stock at any given big box, but I can tell you what to look for. And if you're looking for a light for outdoor use at your home, for example, the attributes that you want to be able to do is something that's going to direct the light so that you're just seeing the light and not the bulb or the diodes. So some sort of shielding. Motion detecting if you have a outdoor light that you need to go on when there's activity. That's good. Um, Look then within those categories, look on the box for the correlated color temperature, CCT. And the lower you can, or the words warm or warm white, or even old school bug lights. There's now LED bug lights. If y'all remember growing up, maybe the yellow incandescent bulbs were bug lights. Still works, right? They just have them with LEDs now. So either a bug light or the lowest color temperature that you can find. If it doesn't say color temperature or it says full spectrum or brags something about that, I would avoid those things and try to get myself to something that's 3,000 color temperature or less, preferably 2,700. And in the future, I hope we'll have more less than that on the market. The less than that right now are advertised as bug lights. Then you can control the brightness. If it's a fixture that has that has bulbs that screw in and out, go ahead and try to accomplish what you can accomplish with the lowest brightness as what you can have. It's hard, right? Because now I'm giving you 6 things to think about, but there are sort of certifications, dark sky friendly, etc. But often at this point, that's about the shielding. And when you think about nature can be down as well as up. And so I want to think beyond just the shielding and think about how bright it is, can you dim it, what color temperature you have, and just trying to make those choices to go with keep it long wavelengths or low color temperature, low to the ground, shielded, and then on as little as possible and only lighting the area that you need.
Okay. Let's see. There's a question about car truck headlights. I don't know if we can have any effect there, but the question is the halogen headlights are blinding.
Yep.
And
LEDs too. Yep.
I presume that that's a negative impact on wildlife as well.
There are certainly effects of headlights on wildlife. There has been a bit of an arms race in headlights. I think there's going to be a little more uh, regulation in that regard because of the glare issues and how much worse the glare gets with age, how much more it affects you as you get older. But it's certainly an area that needs more attention, and I wish we could deal with. There's a group on Facebook called Ban Blinding LEDs, and so if you want to hook up with folks who are looking into that, you can find them there.
Okay. My things are moving too much on my chat. Let's see. The question from a couple of people: do inside lights affect melatonin too?
Inside light, yes, and in fact, inside lights are for most people are going to be the biggest driver of that, and even more so if you spend a lot of time looking at devices. And that's because under normal circumstances, your devices, iPads, tablets, TV screens, etc., have very high color temperature under normal circumstances, and so you can take that under your control by using software. There's a free software called Flux or Flux, which is made by some folks here in LA, that will change the color temperature of your screen depending on the time of day and when you say you want to go to bed. And the people who make that, it's much better than Apple's Night Shift. It's based on science. They work with scientists at Harvard and me and other places on their work, including some of the work that I showed you tonight was with them, the HERFs. And then you tell it when you want to bed, and it will basically take all the blue out of your light, and you're like, yeah, my computer's getting very yellow, and that's like your sign, like, go to bed now. And it's also designed to reduce that inside signal. You can with a device, you can download a Lux app and figure out how bright your indoor lighting is, with some not perfect accuracy. I'm trying to remember the one that I have installed on this phone. The rule of thumb from the chronobiologists, and these are the chronobiologists who don't think that lighting is an impact to anybody because it's not bright enough. Open question. But they say that below 5 lux, you're not affecting your melatonin. And 5 lux, well, full daylight is what, 10,000 lux? A full moon is 1/10 of a lux. So start thinking about, where am I right now? How bright is it in here? I'm sitting in 10 lux of light facing up, and then coming in from the window right now at 6:30 in Los Angeles. It's about 40 lux on my face. Okay, so that's enough to suppress melatonin. So this one, I have no idea. It's just a lux meter on the phone. I wouldn't use it for research, but it's enough to figure out whether you're in the neighborhood. So they would tell you that if you're under 5 lux, but then the other thing I should do here is I should point this at the computer. Okay.
Hold it up a little higher. Okay,
but
we can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, but there's over 10 lux incident on the phone from the computer. So that means if I've got my ambient, nice, quiet, low color temperature indoor lighting, and I'm working on a device that is not adjusted to minimize the blue that's going to intersect with my melatonin suppression curve, I'm suppressing my melatonin by looking at my device. And we have studies that show this too. There's kids, they did a study with kids in Japan where they spent the last half hour before bed either with a full spectrum light, LED, or a traditional oil lamp, which has very little blue. The kids with the oil lamps got to sleep faster, slept better, better circadian rhythm. And we've got a whole bunch of studies that show this now.
Travis, would you repeat the name of the company that you said makes is it an app that you put on your computer or a screen?
Yeah. It's called Flux, Flux, and it might be getflux.org. Yeah, there's a dot in there, f.lux.
F dot lux.
Hold on. We'll get you hooked up here in just a second, and then I'll call. Oh, just get flux. Okay, so I'm gonna put the link here.
Yeah, put the link in the chat if you would.
Yeah, so I'll yeah, so that light can be directly from the light source, or it can be reflected. It doesn't matter if there's a, light is light, and so it does matter what it's reflected off of, because things that are blue are reflecting a bunch of blue, and things that are yellow are reflecting a bunch of yellow. But it can be any of those things. But I have used, now whether it makes a difference or not, the research would suggest it's a possibility. So I also have an adjustable CCT LED lamp on my desk here that goes from about 5,000 Kelvin, which I have on in the day, because the flip side of all this for circadian health for people is the more you're exposed to high color temperature, bright light in the daytime, the better your circadian rhythm is as well. So our natural environment is bright days and dark nights. And now we live in basically dim days and dim nights. And so the dim days part is actually a problem. So being exposed to full daylight, even with your indoor lighting, whatever full spectrum bright light during the day, helps set your circadian rhythm, and you will actually produce more melatonin at night during a day that you've been exposed to full daylight for some period of time. And so it's not an accident that after you spend a day out, whatever, working in the garden, and you like, gee, when your normal day might be working in an office with sort of modestly bright lights, you're like, oh, I slept so great last night. It was so good to, part of that's physiological, having to do with producing more melatonin after being exposed, having your circadian system exposed to that bright full spectrum light during the daytime, and then optimally no light at night. So these two things work together.
One of the things that we have, you've talked about a little bit about shielding, and but not directly about what's available on some of the LED lights. And one of the things that we have found,
yes,
locally, is that if you put a 360-degree short shield on an LED light, that it stops so much of the glare and creation of sky glow. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Yes, sure. So something that everybody should know, especially and this is both for sort of planning processes and one-off situations. Light is in your bedroom window, or light is shining down on a wetland or something. All lighting manufacturers have some form of additional shielding that can go on the street lights. So if you've got a street light, and they get called different things. There's front side shields and back side shields and cul-de-sac shields and 360 shields and all these sorts of things. But all of them basically do the same thing, which is shield it a bit more, because most street lights are designed to throw some light back to grab the sidewalk as well as the roadway. And they're not always installed perfectly, or it's not always flat. And so you can get those lights throwing light where you don't want them. And so you can request, and often municipalities will install a shield for you, just as part of their sort of troubleshooting service. Front side shields and back side shields. For that overpass that I'm working on for the mountain lions out here, we're actually, trying to push California Department of Transportation as far as we can, because we've got all these lights along the roadway that we've got to deal with to make the nice dark path that we want the mountain lions to find, so that they can not have to go into urban areas in order to avoid getting killed by their fathers when they grow up. And so we're like, can you put a backside shield on those lights? And they go back and they're like, okay, yeah, we can do a backside shield. Can you do a front side shield? No, we can't, because the roadway is this wide and we have to hit this amount of illumination on the far lane in order, and this lamp won't do it. And like, okay, fine. Can you change the color temperature? So it's just this incremental, just pull out, keep pulling the tricks out. Can we shorten the poles? And first it was no, we can't shorten the poles because we've done crash testing with the poles, and we know that these poles at this height won't, we can crash a vehicle of X size into them, and somehow the landscape architect convinced them that they could actually shorten the poles without having to do new crash tests. So so it's just like step by step by step. There's trying to get each of these pieces narrowed down and reduce the light incrementally, so that you can keep the engineers and lawyers happy while reducing the impacts.
Thank you. There's a question from a couple of people. Any thoughts about some of the newer engineering for paths / trails / streets that generate lighting in the material itself from a kinetic type of energy?
I've seen these. And the other one is the glow in the dark ones that just capture the sun's light, and then, rocks and all this sort of stuff that will glow in the dark. I'm continue to be of mixed mind about it. They're not super bright, and so they're not going to contribute to a whole lot of glow or anything. They are or can be in areas of the spectrum that are going to affect behavior. And the question for me is always one of relativity, relative to what would be there otherwise. Is this an improvement or not? And so if it's in place of an entire, stream side trail having to have overhead lighting, and that the bike path needs lines on either side to keep people to know where the edge of the trail is, and that's my trade-off for there being 3,000 4,000 Kelvin overhead LEDs every 40 feet, I might be like, bring it on. If it's a national park context and people are supposed to be, it's lighting zone 0, it's supposed to be intrinsically dark, and this is a gimmick a little bit, I might be like, why don't you just use white? Because white is very visible at night and collects all the ambient light, and there's probably enough, except in the darkest of nights when you're going to have a flashlight anyway, white's going to work. And we want a naturalistic environment experience, and that's going to be closer to that for a park situation than a glow-in-the-dark trail. In that instance, I might be like, please, can we solve this another way?
There was a question from a gentleman about how his city changed some older street lights to some really crazy bright ones, and he'd like to do something about it, but he wondered if you have suggestions as to where to start.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I and many other people feel the upset and pain that you're going through from this. And one of the reasons this happens is if you replace high pressure sodium with full spectrum LED on a lumen for lumen basis, technically the same amount of light, it is going to appear much brighter just because of the sensitivity of our eyes and the spectral distribution of the lights. So the first thing to ask is if they've done a lumen for lumen replacement. And if they have, you need to ask them if they can't reduce the illumination. Even the DOE, Department of Energy, in its study of LEDs, compared half power LEDs to full power high pressure sodium, because that's you pretty much have to do that to get anywhere near the same amount of light for it to appear. So anybody who's gone out and given you the same lumen output of a full spectrum light after having high pressure sodium light didn't know what they were doing and got sold a bill of goods by some lighting salesperson probably. And so asking them, could they please see, just try to cut it in half and see how it is. Ask for a test, because these tests are great, because what happens, especially if you can have an isolated location, um, yeah, Deborah, I'm with you, half again if you're at 4,000K, is people will adjust to the amount of light that's there. And Nancy Clanton tells this story, the lighting engineer Nancy Clanton tells this story of a parking lot installation that they were it was in Seattle or somewhere, and they were doing focus groups, and they were very proud of their new parking lot lights, new LEDs, very energy efficient, and look how great you can see everything. And they go out, and so we're going to go out and look at it. They go out, they look at the parking lot. Everybody agrees the parking lot is wonderful, beautifully lit. They love it. They love their new lights and everything. And then Nancy says, did anybody realize that this is actually at half power? And people are like, no, can't possibly be. But of course it is, because we adapt to that level of light. And you adapt to the brightest thing in your view. So if you don't have an arms race with something that's much brighter than something else, you see more when it's dark, when you've got the light, but it's not as bright as it was. So when you've got this LED thing going on, one thing to ask them is, can you do a sample example of something? If you have the power to dim, did they buy anything to allow them to dim, or is there just one setting? If they just did one setting, that's harder, because then you really, to do anything, you've got to change out the head. Often you can get a company to maybe donate a streetlight head and have somebody install it as an example, and see how they either like it or don't like it, or whether they can tolerate it, whether when there's a replacement they can go to lower color temperature. But you've got to be a squeaky wheel and figure out and be ready not to win immediately. Right? Unfortunately, it's very hard to win immediately. But with time, especially like when you go to convert these, could you please go to a lower intensity and a lower color temperature, and get together the resources, and I and other lighting folks can get you those resources to show that there are options. I periodically talk to people around the country about this. Last one was in Orono, Maine, the town I grew up. Somebody's like, they've done LEDs, what do I do? And so we got them some examples of different color temperatures. And over time, we'll probably be able to convince the town to go with a warmer color temperature, and the other tricks, backside shields, front side shields, etc. But I feel your pain there. It's not easy. But if enough people complain, it happened in Davis, it happened in Salt Lake City, it's happened other places, you can get the next generation to be better.
We're talking about the half lumens. Our local community college dropped dimmed their lights in their parking lots down to 10% of what they were designed for. Yep. And did studies, and everybody was like, oh yeah, no, this is great. This is better than it was. It was so bright it hurt.
Yep. Okay,
we have another question in the chat. Does the hertz affect birds too?
So you're referring to the flicker, right? So the speed at which the circuit oscillates and the light flickers, we know very little about that. Let me just put it that way. Now, or maybe you're talking about the wavelength. Yes, and it depends, and it's a little more complicated story than color temperature for wildlife in general. And so so if I'm thinking through this, and if you're thinking about frequency wavelength issues, there are a couple of studies that look at light, color, and bird behavior. But there's lots of bird behaviors, and the one that I think for lights out programs that we're thinking about is migration. So what lights are associated with bird mortality during migration? And what color might be better for lights during bird migration? And the answer there's studies in the lab where they take birds that are, well, it's kind of cute studies. They basically have a funnel that they put paper on, and they put an ink pad in the middle, and then they put a bird in there who's ready to migrate, and the bird will hop consistently in the direction that it wants to migrate. They're very, tuned in that way. Like a certain time of year, they have this thing called Zugenru, this, desire to move, and they actually hop in the direction, the compass direction that they would migrate. And what turns out is that under blue light, they hop in the right direction. Under green light, they hop in the right direction. Under red light, they don't. They hop in all sorts of different directions. This is when you deprive them of the stars and other things as well. This is in a lab. So they can use the Earth's magnetic field as the compass in their head when they have some light, but the light has to be certain wavelengths. It has to do with, I'm sorry, I've gone down a rabbit hole. My apologies, everybody. But there's this molecule that spins in the eyes of the birds, and it needs the light to excite it, and then that cues into the it's in the head of the bird, and then it cues into the magnetic field, and they know what direction. So when you have solid red lights on a communication tower, it kills a lot of birds. So red, even though red for most things on the ground, for from horses to people and whatnot, is very low disruption, is very good for bats, very good for insects, very good for a lot of things. Red lights on a tower isn't good because the birds are attracted to the red, and then they can't orient north because they don't have the right amount of light. They're overwhelmed by the red light. This is conjectural at this point in terms of the proof, but that seems to be the mechanism. There was a study that showed that green light is maybe better for birds. Not sure about that. My argument for migratory birds is they've got a lot of different visual systems, and if they can see it, it's not good. And so we just need to reduce the intensity and and keep it pointed down. I wouldn't at this point try to mitigate bird collisions with spectrum. I would do spectrum for many other reasons, but not for migratory bird. There it's like direction, brightness, and then windows during the day, because then then you have to think about what these animals, once they're attracted to the lights, what they're going to hit and get killed with.
Thank you. That was interesting. So
Yeah.
yes,
Welcome to
and
the
we had
rabbit hole.
comments. We like rabbit holes. That was
Okay, good.
Yes. Let's see. Mimi says, from the ISS's global light photos, Austin, for example, is a bright white city center because a number of years ago it put up these nasty 4,200 Kelvin lights that blind people. Oh, sorry, that part was my comment. And so it shows that it's a bright white city from the ISS photos, with newer northern suburbs glowing amber. So she says, what are we seeing? What's causing the lighting spectrum difference?
Right. Well, I don't know about the new amber lights, whether they're simply the newer suburbs or maybe were built at a time where they were still using high pressure sodium. That's possible. I don't know, except for places that have been forced by the Endangered Species Act, of widespread sort of yellow amber street lighting systems that are not high pressure sodium. They do exist in Florida and Hawaii in response to endangered species and astronomical concerns, and to some degree around observatories. We find that used to be Back County, San Diego County in California had a lot of low pressure sodium yellow. Problem is they don't make low pressure sodium anymore. But what we're seeing in city center is exactly what Cindy said. You're seeing high color temperature lights, either LEDs or other high color temperature metal halide, etc. And compared with probably older high pressure sodium in the suburbs. That would be my bet. And I'd have to go look at Google Street View to look at the lights and figure out if they're actually just LEDs that are filtered or something. Would be amazing, or they're actually just old HPS. And Laura says, seems like LPS is the best for lots of reasons and uses. I love LPS. The problem is they're very big tubes and they don't make them. But we do now have narrow band amber, which is as close as you can get to that from a LED perspective, and phosphor coated amber is very similar. That really concentrate the light at that edge of the spectrum and have just a little bit of the shorter wavelengths, so that the color rendering is better than low pressure sodium. Low pressure sodium, things really just look gray. You literally cannot tell the color between things. But great for astronomy, great for light pollution, great for minimizing impacts.
There's a lighting manufacturer in Oklahoma that's offering lights in the 2000, 2200 Kelvin range that are readily available anywhere in Texas. You just have to get your city or electric co-op or whatever to buy them.
Yeah, and they do. So there is a cost issue, right? But quality is hugely important in LEDs. And working with a manufacturer that knows where their chips are coming from, is getting first quality chips, and is giving you a high quality fixture is going to save money in the long run, even though it's going to be more expensive in the short run. And people need to understand that going in, and I would hope that municipalities have the wherewithal to understand it as well. You can go very wrong with cheap LEDs, and they can fail quickly, and you're out money. It's worth it you're talking about Crossroads, I think, in Oklahoma,
yes,
right,
yeah.
buddy? Yeah, and the folks who are doing this are plugged into this research as well. They've paid attention, they understand, they know what the benefits are, and they need all of us to create this consortium that puts these new sticky ideas out there about what good lighting is, so that the pressure is there on the municipalities to buy from them.
Good. Thank you. Travis, we are coming up on 9 o'clock. I don't know how time just zipped by, but I wondered if you wanted to, have any concluding statements before we thank you and sign off.
Well, thank you, I think, is the thing that I'd like to say. We searched the internet for the term, ecological light pollution. We published that paper in 2004, and it didn't exist. And we've come such a long way, but it's only getting implemented because people intuitively understand that turning the night into day is a bad thing. It's a bad thing for your own health. It's a bad thing for other things. That it is that there's a beauty and a connection to the night. And Catherine, my wife, she had this phrase that night is a place all its own. That we need to respect it as its own place, and that you do that and bring this information to people. It's a hard, long slog, and we've all got these little, battles along the way. But I because the cleanup is so easy once it's done. It's not residual. It's done. You convert it, it's done. This is something that we can do, and we can only do it with you. We who work on this from the sort of scientific and technical side. And so thank you for being there. Thank you for pushing. Thank you for asking the questions, and just keep engaged, and be in touch if you need backup on any of the stuff I talked about.
Yay, lots of clapping. Thank you. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch. I think we've gotten our questions answered, and lots of thank yous coming in for you. So we appreciate,
really appreciate
it, sir.
Yep.
You take care.
All right, you too, Cindy. Always good to see you.
Okay, bye.
All right, bye-bye.